Good morning, Nomad First. How are you all doing? I thought I would prepare for this talk really diligently by getting an early night last night and, maybe doing a cold swim this morning, but unfortunately being English meant that I spent last night drinking beer and spending 2 hours shouting at the TV, having to watch my national team play football. So let's see if my voice gets through. So just a little bit about who I am. I'm originally from Birmingham area in the UK. Anyone ever been to Birmingham? The next Nomad hotspot? Why wasn't Jesus born in Birmingham? They couldn't find 3 wise men and a virgin. It's a wonderful place. It's a very birth of the Industrial Revolution, a really blue-collar town. I'm talking about Plan Bs. I'm certainly not going to talk about citizenships by investment and living off inheritance and that type of stuff. I'm a working class guy, son of a welder and a hairdresser. I've been living in Bansko part-time for the last 2 years and spent my winters in Latin America. My background is actually in procurement and supply chain, and I have a directory website around procurement technology. So this is really a bit of a hobby, something that I've learned a lot about, spent a lot of time reading up on. I came to a few conclusions with events over the last few years of how things are not often what the press and what our governments tell us. So I committed to spending some time to learn about this and put together a plan B. One thing that I'm definitely not going to talk about today is anything overtly political, because it's a very divisive topic and we're not going to go into that. It's more really about putting some facts up there and letting you make your own decisions and plant some seeds in your head about where you may want to focus on in terms of putting together your own plan B. I'm a big fan of having a couple of bases rather than just bouncing around from place to place. I just find it gives me a bit more stability. So what I want to tell you is that you're in such a fortunate position that you get to generate your income location independently, whether you're a remote worker or whether you're a freelancer or whether you have your own business. A lot of people out there would give their kidney to be in your position. So I just think you really need to be making more of that. And instead of just following the herd and going to Bali or going to Lisbon and then in a few years then going back to your home country and getting married and having kids when you've sort of lost the energy to travel, get something from this amazing opportunity that you have. You don't have to commute to the office. You don't have to deal with inflation or the cost of living squeeze or anything that your parents or your friends are complaining about back home. I have a very good friend of mine, Sandra, in Germany, who lives just outside of Frankfurt. She has a good job. She's a dental nurse. She has her own home, her own mortgage, so she's not caught up in the rising cost of rent. And I spoke to her a few weeks ago and said, "Oh, where are you going on holiday this year?" Fairly innocent question. And she started crying and said, "I have no money. The cost of living here is crazy." And that just broke my heart, that someone that works hard and raised her daughter as a single mom now just can't afford a holiday, and she doesn't have an extravagant lifestyle, trust me. So you really have, for anyone that plays poker, you know that that's the best hand that you can get when you play cards. You have the royal flush situation, so make the most of it. A little bit of a story. Any Brits in here? Who's read Watership Down? Or maybe watched the movie? Yeah, you'll know what I'm going on about. Maybe Americans, or Aussies, you may have come across it too. Watership Down it was written in the 1970s, and it's a tale about a group or a warren of rabbits. And this one rabbit called Fiverr, not the freelancing platform, can see into the future, and he sees he sees trouble ahead. And he convinces some of these other rabbits in the warren, who I guess these days would be described as conspiracy theorists by the mainstream press, that they need to leave where they're at and go and find a new life. And the story is all about their journey. But this is one quote from that book, and it describes a lot of people that maybe think there's something wrong, can smell there's something wrong, but they still just go about their merry day and don't do anything about it. And that's dangerous. So why do you need a plan B? Let's jump into the meaty stuff. So let's talk first of all about how indebted some of the household names are in this business. So this is called debt to GDP. GDP stands for gross domestic product, for anyone that's not familiar with basic economics. What this shows is that some of the yellow ones here are what we would class as economically developed countries. Some of the most developed countries on earth, Japan, Singapore, US, UK, Italy, financially they're in the shit. They've got to pay back that debt somehow. It doesn't just get forgiven, you can't just write it off. So who's funding that? Well, they have to pay interest on that debt. And where does that, who's paying for that interest? You as the taxpayer. So instead of that building schools and hospitals or infrastructure, it's going on servicing debt. And then you look at some of the least indebted countries, and then there's a lot of countries that we would probably laugh at in there. But they don't owe a lot of money, and they live within their means. What about real money? Paper money is not real money is gold, or maybe Bitcoin. So who has the biggest gold reserves? If things all go a little bit south and they have to pay back their debt, who has the gold reserves to be able to do that? Well, thankfully, our American friends do have a lot of gold. This is total gold reserves in tons. So obviously, per head of population, those figures would look a little bit differently. But, you look at some of these emerging economies out there that are building up their gold reserves, India, Russia, China. Something's going on. They're all increasing theirs. If you look at who are the biggest buyers of gold, over the past 3 months, 6 months, China is the biggest one. I think Kazakhstan and another couple of others as well. Let's look at budget deficits. So, let's take an example. You earn $100,000 in your job, let's say, or in your business. But you spend $106,000. And you do that year after year after year after year. What's going to happen? Well, that's what the United States of America is doing right now, just with much bigger numbers. UK is a similar position, except they're at about 3.5%. That utopia of digital nomad destination, Spain, is also in another very similar position at about consistently 3.5% year-on-year budget deficits. How are the governments going to maintain their social spending if they're promising everybody jam tomorrow for voting for them just to stay in power? How are they going to maintain that year on year on year? It's certainly not by having lots of babies, that's for sure, because if we look at demographics, and this is just Europe, so sorry for anyone from outside of Europe, but this is the area that I know best. If we look at pensions, fertility, and demographics altogether, because they're very much interconnected. So the graph on the left-hand side, and this is from a British publication, which is why the UK is highlighted in red. There's no reason other than that. So if we take the top bar, Spain, on average, pays out in its pensions 80% of what a person was earning prior to retirement. The same country that spends 3.5% more than what they earn every year. And the same country, if we look at the graphs on the right, that has a fertility rate of 1.18. I think it's too small for me to read. The fertility replacement rate to have a sustainable population is 2.1. The only Western country that has a rate above that is Israel. All of the others have a rate below that. And then we look at some statistics on the right-hand side from Eurostat, which is the Statistics Institute of the European Union. And that shows how many people of working age population will there be to support every retiree. And I won't bore you with the graphic and the details, but basically the darker the color, the bigger the problem, essentially. So you look at these nomad destinations in Southern Europe, and their demographics and their fertility are terrible, and they're spending more money than they're bringing in. Not a good look for the future. Let's look at something a little bit more geopolitical, so water security. I genuinely think, a lot of people think, not just me, it's not just opinion, with the population rising, and will continue to rise until about 2050, 2060 globally, water security rather than oil reserves is probably going to be the next geopolitical chess play. I've circled some areas here that are of interest, so particularly areas in South America, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Colombia, Ecuador, some popular destinations in there, very, very water secure. They're sitting on huge aquifers. Likewise, Central and Eastern Europe is also pretty water secure, whereas certain parts of the US, Spain, the Middle East, North Africa, South Africa, Australia, much of Southeast Asia, doesn't look that great. Then on the right-hand side, we're looking at renewable freshwater resources, which again shows a similar picture. So that is, how much renewable freshwater do you have? In other words, do you have a reliable water supply without relying on desalination or without relying on having to reprocess things like sewage water? Food security, with more mouths to feed and more geopolitical tension. Do you want to be in a country that imports pretty much all their food? It's great to live in Dubai, I guess, if you have a flash car and want to date Instagram models. But what about food security if there's a war? They don't produce anything. All of their food is imported. Do you really want to live there? Okay, pay 0% tax. But what happens when there's no food coming in? Whereas, if you're in somewhere like Bulgaria, Hungary, Turkey, all net food exporters. I think Argentina, is the biggest one. They export something like they produce something like 6 times the amount of food per head of population. What about commodities? Well, in Europe, we have a commodity that we're sitting in, and it's a brown sticky substance, and it's not chocolate. We have no commodities. We have very few raw materials. We import everything. When it comes to oil, okay, the Norwegians have got gas, I guess. We don't have much else. The Americans do, the Australians do, they're in a pretty good position. Latin America is abundant, as is most of Asia, especially China, in terms of raw materials. Where are we going to get our steel from? Where are we going to get our oil from? Where are we going to get our gas and oil from? It's going to be a long time before we can get all of our energy from renewables, and then we've got to store it somehow if we're going to be able to live off renewable energy exclusively. And it seems that nuclear power is a bit of a political taboo topic in Europe. Energy, so where is the least dependent on fossil fuels? I was in Paraguay this winter. Paraguay gets 100% of its energy from hydropower. And not only that, they export some of that back to the Brazilian grid. Why? Because they had the foresight in the 1970s to build a huge hydroelectric dam between the two countries and create energy security. And then probably the biggest one, and I don't want to move to a more depressing note than already, but this one is the big one. Even if you live in a country that has food security, energy, is financially well off or is not in debt, who's heard of a CBDC or who knows what it is? Okay, some of you don't. It's called a central bank digital currency, and it's the fast lane to tyranny. If a government implements a central bank digital currency, it can basically block and ban you from spending your money. It works on the blockchain like a cryptocurrency, except it's controlled by the government. So if you say something politically incorrect on social media, no food today. Or if you're reliant on universal basic income to get your welfare, and you do something, you drive your car too far, or you use too much energy, they can block you. So I probably want to be in a country that's not planning to implement this anytime soon. And unfortunately for us Europeans, our good friend Christine Lagarde has said that they're going to implement a digital euro from 2027 onwards. And that doesn't mean that your cash and your other forms of currency will be turned off overnight, but it will be a slow boiling of the frog with propaganda until everyone signs up for it, by hook or by crook. Let's talk a little bit about quality of life, because we've done a lot of fear already. So when you look at this graph, you kind of realize why us Northern Europeans are so miserable all the time. I spent 40 years in countries where it rains and where it's cloudy and where the sun doesn't shine very much. And then you go to somewhere like, I don't know, Argentina or Spain or Turkey, and everyone's happy and everyone's, oh. But it's true, it affects our mood. It really affects our mood. I notice it myself that during summer and when I'm somewhere where the sun's shining, I'm just generally less irritable, and you can take walks in the morning, tank some energy, tank some sunlight before starting your day, and it has a huge impact on your well-being. So what to do? Let's talk the last sort of 7 or 8 minutes about practical tips. So if you're not in a position to drop everything and go and get a second residency somewhere and go and live in one of these new emerging countries that have food, water, and energy security and have low national debt, then what can you do right now? Well, as the last speaker was also saying, invest in diverse markets. So if you're investing in stocks or maybe buying property, look at doing it in maybe 2 or 3 different countries, or get exposure to different currencies, so as then you're less prone to geopolitical shocks. Hold your wealth in multiple countries. I guess a lot of you have accounts with Revolut or Wise or similar sort of neobanks. And while I wouldn't recommend putting like big amounts in there, because they've been known to block accounts and close down accounts at the drop of a hat, it generally gives you a bit more opportunity to diversify and maybe hold some Singapore dollars or Swiss francs, or currencies that are not geopolitically exposed as much, like the US dollar and the British pound and the euro. Hold tangible assets. It's a lot harder for the government to confiscate your gold or your real estate than it is for them to invade your bank account or to steal your stocks and shares. Something that you can touch is a lot harder for a government to take away than something that they can't. Governments have a bit of form when it comes to stealing your wealth. It's not the first time that they've done it. So I know what you're saying. Yeah, that's great, but governments in these banana republics are all corrupt, but we're from Europe, we're American. Our governments don't do that. I beg to differ. A lot of corruption out there, as COVID showed us with who governments were giving consultancy contracts to and PPE purchase orders. A lot of favors being done. The only difference is in Europe and in North America, the corruption's done by graduates of top universities, and they rebranded it. It's not called corruption. It's called lobbying. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. You think the government's not going to take any money from you? It's happened. In the 1930s, the US government seized the gold assets of their citizens. In 2013, during the Euro crisis, when there was a banking crisis in Cyprus, the central bank implemented capital controls, and you could only take €1,000 a day out of your Cypriot bank account. In any other world, when it's not the government or a central bank doing it, it's called theft. If the mafia did that, what would you call it? What about crime? I can't go to one of these emerging markets, it's dangerous. Okay. These are crowdsourced crime statistics. I don't really trust official statistics because that's based on crimes that get reported. Anyone that's lived in a major city in Western Europe that's had their bike stolen realizes that it's a waste of time reporting it to the police because they're not going to do anything about it. So I do trust official crimes, I do take official crime statistics with a little bit of skepticism. These are crowdsourced from Numbeo, which is an online platform where you can compare things like cost of living and crime and social stuff in various different cities. Great platform actually for nomad planning. So you're probably saying, you're just cherry picking, you've picked a dangerous city in Europe and you've picked a safe city somewhere else. Okay, let's look at a second example. Latin America's dangerous, right? Especially Brazil. Brazil. Everyone gets shot there, everyone gets robbed there, everyone gets bugged there. Well, maybe you would in Brussels as well. Don't believe the narrative of your public service broadcasting organization because it's biased. So how can you benefit from all of this? So the easy one is, and this is especially if you're from the US or Canada or Australia and you maybe have European descent somewhere in your heritage, can you get a second passport through Ancestry? Because that's the easiest way. Other than the costs of a lawyer and the fee to pay the embassy to get the documents, it's pretty much free. What about the rest of us? So can you get residency in a peaceful, emerging country that ticks as many as possible of these boxes? Number one, rich in natural resources, always good to have. Wars are fought over natural resources, not over human rights or anything that all of these lefty lawyers talk about. Food and energy secure, because if the US Navy is no longer protecting the seas, then where's your food going to come from? Not heavily in debt, because, surprise, surprise, it's got to be paid back at some time, unless there's a crash in the financial system somehow. Ideally, that has a young population and that has a fertility rate that is sustainable, or at least, if they don't have that, then that they don't have a very generous welfare system would be the other alternative. If a country does have low fertility but they don't have a welfare system to fund, then it's not as bad. Ideally, an economically liberal economy with relatively low regulation, because, I said I'm not going to talk about politics, but on balance, generally, economies that are more free and more open do better than economies that are more protectionist and more closed. Who knows what a territorial tax system is? Oh, I'm impressed. Great. For those of you that don't, a territorial tax system is a tax system that only taxes the income that you're making in that country. So if all of your income is coming from a foreign source, let's say your income is in Europe, but you have residency in a territorial tax country somewhere in Asia or Latin America, then that income is essentially tax-free in that country. Or that has low rates of personal and corporate income tax. Bulgaria, for example, would fall into the second category with 10% for both. Ideally, I would want to live in a country that's peaceful and neutral. I personally wouldn't want to be a citizen or be resident of a country that's building military bases all over the world, and that's invading other countries, or that's funding NGOs to fabricate revolutions all over the world. And then finally, crime stats that are moving in the right direction. Every single metric that you look at in Europe, we're going in the wrong direction. North America as well. And then finally, although this one can kind of change depending on what political party is in power, but how did the country that you're looking at as potentially a plan B react to the pandemic? I used to think before that Australia was kind of a nice place to live. It's sunny, they speak English, you can get bacon and egg for breakfast, important for British people. And then I looked at how they behaved during COVID and thought, there's no way I'm setting foot in that country. I leave you with a quote from Danish author Hans Christian Andersen, which I think we can all relate to. And a little bit of further reading, so if you want to take a screenshot of that, these are some good books about individual freedom, geopolitics, the state of the world, some of the changing world order that's going on, if you want to just have a bit of light background reading before you go to bed. Or an audiobook when you're at the gym to make you angry and run faster. And that, I'm selling nothing, but there is a link to my link tree. I do have a Substack that I set up that I want to do more of, just writing articles and maybe growing a bit of community in this space for anyone that's interested in personal freedom, taxes, geopolitics, lifestyle, residency, because it all comes together. We all often think as nomads that we just want to go somewhere and pay less tax, or that has better weather, but it's kind of all interconnected. Thank you.